I'm a statistician, and I cheerlead statistics, obviously. But one of the things I tell my students on day one of a stats class is statistics, by its nature, is dehumanizing. And what I mean by that is statistics is not about the individual.
Yeah.
Statistics is about measuring the group as a whole. And so very, very crudely, I say in the book, but I think it makes a memorable point, the average human being has one testicle and one ovary. Okay?
Right.
That's not one human being on the planet.
Right.
But yet that's the statistical average.
Right.
So from a very personal, practical standpoint, that's like meaningless.
Right.
And so we just need to understand what statistics are so that they can be framed and used in the appropriate way. And only then do I think, from a Christian worldview, do they become something that we really want to be using and working with.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, podcast listeners of all ages and stages, welcome. Bienvenue chez épisode 99. That's episode 99 of the Jolly Thoughts podcast. Man, we're just one measly episode away from cracking into the triple digits. Might have to do something, I don't know, to mark that semi-momentous occasion. We'll see. But today, we're not thinking about the future, we're thinking about the right now. So this episode is with Jason Wilson. Jason Wilson is as you'll hear, he's a professor of statistics at Biola University. Had his co-worker, Carmen Joy Imes, with us not too long ago, but Jason is coming. I mean, he actually has a unique vantage point in some respects because he does have a degree in Bible. But he spent most of his time, and not just educationally, but professionally thereafter, in the area of maths and statistics. And so he wrote a book called Statistics and Faith, a Christian guide to telling the truth with data. And when this came across my desk, I thought, this is a conversation I'd like to have. So it's very interesting what he does throughout the book. And then he gets to tease out just a few of those kind of aspects when we chat together. I think you'll find it enlightening. All of us see stats all the time. We're just like constantly bombarded with both the external nature of statistics. So how many percentages of these people do this, but then also things that come our way that have been generated by and decided by, informed by statistics. And so I think having some better literacy in this area is huge, but also from a Christian and a faith perspective, also super huge. So I found this to be a really, really fascinating conversation. And I hope that you will too, not just fascinating, but helpful. So if that's the case, as is always, let us know. Drop us a note, share it with somebody. It's good. Sharing is caring. So without any further ado, this 99th episode of Jolly Thoughts Podcast with Jason Wilson.
So I married a Californian, and my kids are Californian. My driver's license says California, so I sense that. But on the inside,
wide open spaces, more of a
more of a rural guy.
Okay, Montana.
I'm here. Yeah, here for the ministry.
Yeah. Okay. But you also went to, if my biographical sketches from reading your book, Statistics and Faith, stack up, you did go to UC Riverside.
Yeah. Went to UC Riverside, and I actually came to California for undergrad. And I'm a alumni from Biola University, actually, where I'm teaching now.
Okay.
So that was the first time that's when I started, living in California.
So you go to Biola as undergrad, and you took, was there multiple undergrads at play here? Kind of loop us in a little bit,
I got a double
Jason,
degree. I got math and biblical studies theology.
Right. And I got to think that you are a small handful of of people who got that combo of degrees. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that was a very popular
No, it's
combo.
pretty rare. Yeah, 'cause it's a pretty big spread on, both of those sides. There's no overlapping classes.
I wouldn't have thought so. Maybe numerology or something like that,
Yeah.
but yeah, not a lot. So that's interesting. So, what, why, what, why that combination of
Well, that's a
classes?
good question. So basically, when I came to Biola as a freshman, I was like a nominal believer at best. The Lord just sort of lured me in because I was on an intellectual quest. Uh, I wanted to find out like what was really true. Like, is God really real? Um, my mom started taking me and my sister to church after she divorced my dad, and uh, and we there's a little time lag, and then she remarried and moved to Nevada, and so that puts me in second grade, and I'm like growing up in these small town, conservative churches, and they're, talking about Jesus, but I'm getting a public school education, and they're talking about how they know how the world was created, and uh, family life just wasn't the place to sort those things out, given the divorce, and so. Yeah, so I wound up at Biola because the secular schools that I had contact with didn't really seem very amenable to the conversation, and so that's what led me there. And then that first year, the Lord just got a hold of me. I mean, intellectual questions got answered. I encountered people who they like actually embodied what I would read about in the Bible. I just, in my level, I hadn't quite encountered it that way before. And just the powerful worship experiences, and just holistically, the Lord just drew me to Himself. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, I can study mathematics, what I really came here for. I can study the eternal Word of God, and that really drew me. And so I almost chucked the math, but I couldn't get a witness in friends or family to agree that that was a great idea to just do a wholesale change of major.
I see.
And so I wound up just going for a double degree.
Well, and I think that we're probably grateful that you did. Although, I mean, I don't know how much coffee you had to consume to get through that, and during that time, I'm sure that was
Yeah.
a lot of extra effort. But yeah, that, I mean, that really sets up nicely this kind of, um, I mean, maybe at times it will be described in your journey as a tension, but oftentimes it seems to be, I don't know, what you wrote down doesn't read like tension. What you wrote down reads like balance points in some respects. This idea that um, there's this kind of like the scientific, rational kind of ways of reading the world, which are great, and then these other kind of experiential points. In fact, to kind of get us into the conversation, maybe in some respects, if I can find this quote, um, page 32 on statistics and faith, what math and Bible, statistics and faith.
Here we are.
Determining what is correct is a science, and truth is reality. And I thought that was a great little kind of a kind of a just kind of plop that soundbite out of your book here a little bit to say that um, you've kind of given a bit of a somewhat unique contribution into the book sphere here in some respects with this book, subtitled "A Christian Guide to Telling the Truth with Data." And so this is, I don't know how many years ago it is that you're an undergrad. Call it 15, call it 20. What are we looking at? A
Oh, no,
couple,
no, no. We're more on 40 here. I was 92 to 96.
okay, well, closer to 30. That, don't age
Or
yourself. I'm
sorry,
30.
30,
It's 30.
30. Yeah.
You're the numbers guy, but so it's been a while. So I mean, obviously, somewhere in that, you kind of in the close of the book, you mentioned that this is a book that, in many respects, you've been writing for a very, very long time. So what is it then in those kind of intervening years that gives you this kind of notion? Hey, this is a book that I think people need to read. What is it that kind of led you towards that?
Wow. Such a good question. Just a prefatory remark. There's an article that was published by a guy named Dick DeVoe called Math is Music,
Mm.
Statistics is Literature. Math is music, statistics is literature. It's a really nice read. It's more of an essay. It's not a technical paper, but he talks about how you can have these genius mathematicians and genius musicians at a very young age. And I'm talking like 4, 5, 6, 8 years old that can do these amazing things. You don't have a literary genius of that age.
That's right. That's
And
right.
nor a statistical genius. And the
Right.
reason is it requires life experience and acquaintance with the world.
Mm.
And so that's one sort of way of thinking of the difference between math and statistics. And I think your question had to do with how this integration. So I was very interested in bringing the two together, but my world was really kind of math, and statistics came a little bit later to me. But even that had to really mature and process. And so in the same way that you get math as music, statistics as literature, I think there was that process for me as I not only learned the discipline of statistics, but just needed more life experience to uh, put some of my ideological theories to the test and find out what was real, what was true, what stood up, what didn't, and uh, you know get married, have children, life experiences. Uh, so I feel like that's
Yeah.
a
Yeah,
big
of course.
aspect of it.
That's great. Uh, so I love that idea. Matt, I'm gonna look up that article. Maybe I could even if I can find it, I'll drop it in the show notes here. I just think it's a really helpful thing because like math, in some respects, I've heard it described as it being. I know that certain ancient Greeks were kind of fascinated with it being kind of this universal language. I don't know enough about math. My wife is actually a math instructor. She kind of leads, and so but I kind of got off that train around grade 11, and I use calculators now. That's pretty much what I do. But this idea that it's kind of an innate kind of a universal language, and so it's kind of like you don't. I've heard it said sometimes you don't learn math, you remember math. Like in other words, like it's so kind of ingrained that it like once you see that 2 and 2 equals 4, it doesn't require like anything more than just like oh that is reality. But that is and music in some respects is the same way, right? You play 2 notes on the piano and all of a sudden you can see the relationship between them, and it sounds pleasant or it doesn't sound pleasant. It's very kind of black and white in some respects in that but literature, like you said, you can't learn how squiggles on a paper or pixels on a screen, you can't just kind of piece that together. It requires somebody teaching you to do that, right? And then you become somebody who can enter the discourse. And so, similarly with stats, I guess we need a tutor. We need some help along that. So that's why I think this book uh, could be helpful for people. That's why I found it kind of helpful as I was kind of reading through it. We said statistics a few times though, and in some respects, kind of negatively. I don't mean like we've said it that we don't not spoken of it negatively. We've kind of said like what it isn't, but what is it in a positive way? So if you had to describe to somebody statistics, how would you define it?
Right. Yeah. So I try to consider my audience as to how deep I'm going to go, but kind of a first pass is statistics is basically the discipline that tries to discover the truth about the world through data. That's what it's really trying to do. Discipline tries to discover the truth about the world through data, and that's my
the
starter.
the term itself. So first of all, you can rest assured the people who are listening to this podcast are veritable geniuses. So we can go deeper. But the word itself, it's funny. I had never seen it before. You kind of get into in it was either chapter 1 or 2. I think it's chapter 1. You
Chapter
kind of get
one,
into
yeah.
the etymology of the word, like kind of where it came from. And I was like, when I saw that, I was like, man, I don't know why. I mean, this kind of makes sense, but kind of from a like where the English term comes from, if I can recall it correctly, is this idea of it's a portmanteau. It's two words that are put together. So you have state So in other words, like kind of like governmentals, in other words, like kind of, or population based, so state arithmetic. So math that is kind of like to the benefit of or sourced in or from the state. Is that kind of correct? Is that where the term basically comes from?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And in the course of world history, you would have governments that are basically they'll have people that are keeping records and they'll try to use that information for the benefit of their government. And I'm not imputing either a positive or negative motive to that. I think you'd find both in world history, but it's a governmental level with lots of people to do this work, and they're thinking we need to count everybody, we need to count everything. And that's the way it is up until after the scientific revolution in the 1600s. You start to get some mathematical ideas that become underpinnings for a leap, where you say, wait a minute, we can actually just take a sample out. We don't have to have everything. And we can use math to make an inference from just the subsample to the whole population. And that doesn't really emerge until the end of the 19th century, early 20th. And that's the statistical revolution that then rolls through the 20th century. And we are still kind of reeling in that today. It's what empowers our technologies, mathematically speaking.
For sure. Is it on a similar timeline that it also gets decoupled from the state? Because when I think of statistics, I don't inherently think of them as being governmental. I mean, I live in Canada. Just a few months ago we had to fill out our census data. We didn't have to go to Jerusalem or Bethlehem for it or anything like that. But yeah, like it was required. Like it basically was threatened. Like if you don't fill this out, we will use the full measure of the law to come get you, etc. But I don't think of that as the exclusive or even the primary way that I engage with statistics anymore. So when did it kind of get decoupled from governments?
Yeah, it's the decoupling is happening around that time.
Okay.
Um, yeah, that's because that was the revolution where if you look at definitions of statistics, they're going to have to do with estimating a state at a determined epoch. And then you get this shifting to where, no, we're going to use randomness in order to make inferences about a sample.
Mm.
And you get a little blending of definitions in the early 20th century, and then it's just totally the modern definition.
And you spend a lot of time in the first couple chapters trying to explain how that sampling works. And I must confess, I'm sure listeners to this podcast would definitely get it if they were working through it, but it was not too far into the arithmetic of it or the letters standing in for numbers of it that I was like, and I'm out. So I couldn't quite follow all of it, but it's a good point that what it is raising is if you had 100 people and you asked and you looked at the color of their eyes, you could tell over time what the percentage of those 100 people had the color blue in their eyes. There is no inference from that. It's literally just counting it and seeing like, okay, there's 25 of those 100 people had blue eyes. It's when you then say, based on that 100 people, this is what I think the number of 1,000 people or 100,000 people with blue eyes will be like. And that's where I guess I hadn't considered before just the kind of the complexity and how small data sets and how the relationship to larger data sets kind of starts to work. So one of the things that you then, again, near the beginning of this book, you have essentially a couple parts to the book. So the first
Yeah.
part is the history of statistics, and then not just the history of it, but then kind of essentially kind of like best practices or a way to think through how they actually get used. And your goal, as I understand it, is to then help people not only understand the terminologies and the way they're applied, but then to think biblically, think wisely about statistic use. And then that's kind of what the remainder of the book is. It gives you a bunch of different instances of statistical thinking, and then how should we then think about these kinds of things. So going back to then this opening section, you give us a bit of a window into an early dark turn in what statistics can be or where it came from. And it's funny that within a week, the two different books that I've been looking at in terms of science, and then a podcast that I've listened to that also speaks about history, all three of them use this word, which I hadn't heard in a long time, and now I'm kind of freaked out by, is eugenics. And so how did kind of counting things and this obsession with trying to understand proportions and numbers and stuff like that, how did that lead to this kind of eugenic turn? And also maybe you could define for us what eugenics are.
Right. So eugenics is basically scientifically motivated racism. To be more specific, it's an attempt to make a scientific theory and say, hey, we know that evolution's true and species are selected according to their best traits, and we've got these different races of human beings, and so you can sort through the races and look for the ones that have the best traits. And eugenics is the idea of affirming that on a national level and instituting public policies that will help to promote the more fit races, or at least people within your population, and then minimize the reproduction of the people with the undesirable traits. It's on record that there were over half the US states had some form of eugenics public policies in place in the early 20th century. There are provinces in Canada that also had this, and areas in the United Kingdom as well. Uh, it is the kind of scientific philosophy that was undergirding Hitler's Third Reich. It's very natural to want to eliminate an entire race of people if you have a scientific justification that they're just an inferior group of people. Um, it's abominable. It's reprehensible. Fortunately, our cultures have agreed with that and largely tried to get rid of that, which I think is a good thing. However, when you kind of erase it from history and you don't talk about it, then you're not teaching the youth in such a way that they can learn that very important lesson. And so it does still peek its head up in different ways these days, including a, there's a currently published book that's advocating for eugenics that I cite in my book. Um,
Yeah. So how is it that something like, wanting to find out the yield for wheat in a certain area or whatever, or like how is it that kind of counting, like how did statistics lead to eugenics?
yeah, it's a great question. So I'm not a historian to be able to give a definitive answer on that, but I think a really important piece of the answer is this guy by the name of Sir Francis Galton. He was a cousin of Charles Darwin, and he was a certified genius. I mean, this is a very bright guy. He was very wealthy, and so he had the leisure and the means of pursuing his own intellectual pursuits. He was the money behind the first statistics department and and journal. So this is at University College London. It's referred to as the Statistics Department today, but its original name had the word eugenics in it. And so, even from the founding, because of the money and the interests of Sir Francis Galton, he puts that down. The journal was called Biometrica. But Sir Francis Galton, what he wanted to do was put biology on the same kind of footing that Newton did for physics. So that's what he wanted to do. And statistics was the discipline that emerged because it accounts for variation. Whereas physics, you very exact, like these underlying principles described with exact mathematical formulas. Statistics, we have the randomness modeled. And so he wanted to employ that and sort of give the quote unquote mathematization of biology, and statistics became that language.
I see. So then it led the way to kind of creating frameworks where people could understand, or felt like they could understand patterns, and then they detected patterns, and then the next obvious move is always, how do we I'll say weaponize or deploy or take control of the patterns in some respects.
Yeah, there's just a clear ideological framework that they're bringing in this belief about the truthfulness of Darwin's theory, and
Right.
they want to start applying that in
Mhm.
in places.
Yeah.
Clearly, we use statistics in all kinds of things in the world, but they had this, at least when I say they, I'm talking about Galton, I'm talking about Carl Pearson, who was that first chair at this new statistics department. So those guys had some ideology going on. And I think it also illustrates for us as believers how the worldview can have a big impact on what's done with real tools.
Mm.
Are you going to go in a good direction or are you going to go in a bad direction? Same tools.
Totally fair. Yeah, I wonder. I mean, I kind of have a bit of a mishmash of thoughts kind of cruising through my head, so I don't know if it'll frame out very well. But I recently finished the in English it's called the Technological Society, um, or is it the Technical Society? Anyways, Jacques Ellul, his kind
Oh,
of
okay.
1960s book, and it's all about,
Mm.
it's the usually the word in there is technique, is the word that he ends up using, and it's all about how culture is constantly, like, once technique has been discovered, it can't. It's almost like he talks about, almost like the way that Paul talks about like sin or death, like it's as a capital T, like technique. And so technique kind of, once it emerges into the world, it's a force that acts upon us way more than we act upon it. And so it's just always this notion that as soon as you have something that can try to become more, um, uh, how do I want to say that, like a little bit more efficient. As soon as you can, like efficient, like technique just kind of operates upon us to make things efficient. So I'm now, this is real time thoughts, sorry, but I'm kind of wondering how that kind of interacts with statistics. Um, so in other words, once we can measure something, and I know this is a struggle as a non-scientist. I know this is a struggle with a lot of scientists just kind of, I think anyway, this is the character, kind of just want to do the work. Like, leave me alone to explore how things work. But that doesn't fund anything. So what funds things is application from the science, and that's the case with, bio, for anything bio. It's the case with anything, physical for sure, physics related, I mean. And I'm sure it's also the case in terms of statistics. Like, if all you wanted to do was determine the color, what's the preponderance of colors of eyes, there would be no money in that. But if there's a way of saying, now we can actually sell contact lenses that change people's colors of eyes, or I don't know, or like we can do insurance related quotes based upon the colors of people's eyes. Like, if it has to, in some respects, lead towards an applicable outcome. Um, that's the only thing that interacts with the public in some respects. And so this is a very long, I'm sorry, but in a kind of a circuitous way of saying, I've noticed that when you get into the application parts of your book, part of it has to do with how people interact with, like, headlines. So I sent you in advance, like, I one of the things that I do, on top of kind of the other things I do, is I work with a team of researchers that's called worship leader research. And we are just in the middle of releasing kind of the largest, the results of the largest interdenominational worship leader survey That's as far as we can tell, that's ever been done. We had about over 3,500 respondents to this survey, and
Impressive.
but yeah, it's I mean, I mean, the SBC seems to have just released one where they maybe have close to 5,000 kind of within the SBC, which is in and of itself pretty wild. But ours spans across different denominations and whatnot. But it's what I'm trying to say is we have it. That's great. People don't care about the survey. What they care about is the findings of the survey. And that requires analysis, which is interpretation. And then it also requires, even if you interpret it and analyze it and then put it on the internet, it will sit there. It requires essentially promotion. You have to like promote the findings of it, right? Like you have to somehow, like, how are you going to frame it? Like somebody put a cover on your book, right? Somebody got people to recommend it and give little blurbs on the back, right? Somebody said, "Hey, what are we going to call it? What are the names of the?" We're doing a podcast right now to be able to talk about it, promote it, right? So, what is it then about statistics, and what are the things that we need to be wary of when it comes to engaging with this is the end of this circuitous route here. 9 out of 10 dentists recommend this toothbrush. That's like a small little statistic that we're constantly bombarded with or whatever. So what are the kinds of ways that you want Christians to be able to think about and interact with the copious amounts of statistical information that they're kind of bombarded with on at this point in time, a daily basis?
So
Yeah.
can I put a pause on that? Because I feel like you had a question earlier in your part. You talked about technique
Yeah.
from Ilol,
Yes.
and I felt like you almost wanted to ask, what's the relationship between statistics and this technique that you're talking about? Is kind of like this force.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think there's a pretty clean answer, uh, that statistics as a discipline and in practice is fueling this technique philosophy, which is implemented or manifested in all of our technology. And
Yes.
here's how. Just between you and me right now, we have these headphones on, we have manufactured clothing, we have these computer screens. All of these things were created in factories. In order for factories to get to the level of quality control that we enjoy right now, that requires measuring the outputs and how far things are off from their parameters and getting that down finer and finer and finer until you can have the types of electronic devices and precise things that we have today. And all that's enabled by statistics. And so I and again, that's really, really good in so many ways. We benefit. But these things then can also get used for ill as well.
Sure.
And so
Yeah,
just
and also like the the fact that that we're having this conversation, that that happens because of, well, listenership. So in other words, if there was no audience for the conversation, then that wouldn't happen. But we, the good people at IVP and other people, we statistically analyze whether or not there will be people who will listen to these conversations, right? Uh, and so and then we analyze our time and we say what's going to be a good use of our time. That's where like both the analysis portion of statistics and then the technique driven parts of our day, I do feel like they're kind of, once you see them, you kind of you can't unsee them, but it's a force that we can't seem to stop either in some respects. Like um one thing that I'm challenged to think about is like, how often would people choose a difficult thing instead of an easy thing, or a inefficient thing instead of an efficient thing, like on purpose? Like how often would people choose to do that? And the answer is, you would only do it if all of a sudden you really felt like, I need to break this pattern, like I need to stop this kind of like overwhelming force of technique in my life. But statistics and these kinds of statistical analyses are constantly trying to give us the information required for we open this conversation in some respects about like traffic, about like how to get to Biola University, right? Like
Mm.
if you opened your phone, it wouldn't say here's the slowest way to get to Biola. It would say here's the fastest way to get to Biola, right? And everything is like the fastest, and like we used a calendar invite to schedule this conversation, because what we could have done is we could have sent a whole bunch of messages back and forth and said like, well, what's the best time for you? I don't know what's the best time for you, but instead we used technological means to choose the most efficient way. And it's I do think that statistics, in ways that I definitely can't see, are happening in the background to make all of these technologies happen. Like you mentioned, like statistics is the fuel that essentially technique is burning up to keep us moving in a certain direction.
Yeah, and values play the role in this efficiency thing, because when we're making decisions, then if we're valuing the time, we're valuing the money, uh, whatever we're holding up as those values in order to make the efficient decision. If the value is shifting, it's like, no, I'm valuing the maybe the slower pace to spend time with the person on the journey.
Mm-hmm.
Then letting go of that. Oh, I need to get there the quickest possible route, for example. But then that's another place of integration. There is, what are the values that are governing the actual process?
Right. And I think you would like them to be Christian values, or at least that's what the book is kind of implying.
Yeah, that's what I think we would want to see there, because um, in a given company, then that company is going to have to make a decision. They're going to have a certain culture. They've got some values. Maybe they're fully stated, maybe they're not. But yeah, as believers, we have a source in God's word of, where are our values coming from.
Thank you for rescuing
Yeah.
me from that very, very roundabout question. So then, in light of that, how should, in light of a Christian worldview, what should we be kind of keeping our eyes open for? You give a bunch of different examples, like I said in the book. You talk about gambling, you talk about how to think through the probabilities of the origin of life, but kind of on a macro level, or maybe even dipping down into some of these examples, how should we, start to think about statistics as Christians?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay. So Uh, in 1954, a guy named Darrell Huff published a book called How to Lie with Statistics, and it spawned a small literature. There's other books and articles published kind of in that vein, and what you find in them is often a fun and humorous collection of a whole bunch of disparate instances of misuses of statistics, maybe mistakes, maybe intentional. And the idea there is to just learn by a bunch of examples. And uh, as I was writing my chapter 5 and my chapter 7, which are covering this space, kind of how to lie with statistics area, and I reviewed all that literature, I came to the realization that there's two primary approaches one could take on this. And the analogy I'd like to make is with how the US government trains, probably other governments do this as well. I'm a US citizen, and so I figured I'm going to just do US government. How they train our, uh, let's
Counterfeit
see,
detectors?
yeah, counterfeit detectors. It's SS. It's our security something to detect counterfeit. They could either be given, here's a list of all the different ways that people do the counterfeiting. Look for all these different things. Or they could be trained really well on, here is our money and here is its features, and we want you to learn this really, really, really well. When you encounter something that deviates from these, that's the counterfeit stuff.
Yeah.
So you have a falsehood model or a truth model. The Huffian How to Lie with Statistics is all on this model. It's just giving you lots of lots of wrongs. What I wanted to do differently was, and I think this is a more Christian oriented approach, is I want to just focus on what's right. So that if you come to understand kind of the basic essence of statistics, and we took our first pass at the at definition of statistics,
Mhm.
and you said we want to go deeper. And so going a little bit deeper, it's the study of how to collect, organize, analyze, and interpret data. Those are the four parts.
Mhm.
And so I want to give an understanding of those four parts from that truth perspective. And then at the end of that, chapter 2, which I state at the beginning of that chapter, hey, this is a heavy chapter, like skim, take it light, however. Um, but I lay that out. And then at the end of chapter 4, or that chapter, I talk about from those four categories, what are the key questions to ask along what is kind of the art and aptness, what is the science and correctness, and then what is the truth reality on those different areas. And that gives a model or a framework of how to actually think about any instances of statistics out there in the wild.
Mhm.
And although you could take that and like apply it in a given instance, with reading through the book, the hope is you'll get a little bit of familiarity with the four parts. And once you have those four parts down, as you're encountering statistics, you go, wait a minute. Where'd they get that data from?
Mm.
How's that? That's something smells a little fishy there,
Mhm.
because you have a sense of what's right about data collection. Or now, wait a minute, that graph seems a little off. There's something that's off about this graph. You may not even be able to identify it, like on the Huffian model. Oh, look at this graph. Here's this thing. Blah blah blah. Um, but that can help you on that overall assessment. And so that's my approach, is by gaining that familiarity with the authentic, and then practicing sharpening by some experience.
It's good. And then you later on, maybe it's chapter 5. I'm not sure, but I think it's how to lie to people with statistics. Maybe it's in
That's
that
5.
chapter. 5. You kind of use a C.S. Lewis um, kind of a trope or whatever his concept, and then apply that to statistics. The kind of liar, lunatic, or Lord model, which is I think intuitively, maybe, I don't know, it resonated with me. Maybe it is because of my work with research sometimes, but I do get the sense that people are now dubious. Some people are wholesale, like, I saw it on the internet, so it's true. But hopefully, a lot less people are like that. But
Yes.
then what that comes with, though, is like, frankly, how it manifests in me is just general incredulity. Like I can't trust anything that I see, and then also kind of coupled with that is this idea that any stat that I see, maybe people are trying to kind of hoodwink me. But you give the example, you give this as an example to work through a bunch of different things and say you can see incorrect analysis or incorrect data. It can happen, but it won't always be because someone's trying to lie to you. It could be, or it could just be they did something incorrect. So, do you want to say some more about how you think that's a helpful kind of framework for people?
Yeah, especially when we're taking in some news, right? And like even at the beginning of this podcast, I said, "Oh yeah, 40 years ago," and you said, "No, it was 30 when you gave me the date." And
That's right.
like boom, it just
Yeah.
simple miscalculations, simple mistakes, they just happen all the time. And that's also true of a journalist managing their article, or when you're speaking impromptu and whatever, like that kind of stuff happens. And if I'm listening to somebody and they make a mistake, they're doing a like, no big deal. I'm gonna still try to receive, what they've honestly got going, and like, oop, mistake. We need to kind of be careful of that. And like, does that affect everything, or was it just that one-off piece I can separate and still get the thing? You can still sort of stay in the game and be in line with what you were trying to consume that medium for. Whereas over here, if they're actually doing this on purpose, they're twisting something, they're trying to deceive, well, now you've detected a lie, or at least I mean, you could start to talk about nuances on that, but to just keep it simple, if somebody's trying to lie or manipulate, that's a completely different matter, right? That's when you just boop, we're not going to take that source. You're done. So how you handle it is really impacted by that act of discernment right there.
Mhm. And you give us some tools for that. I mean, I don't think I don't know. I'm wondering if you would say you read through this book, you read through the first couple chapters, and now you'll be able to tell every time whether or not, because oftentimes things are quite obscured. The sources of things are quite obscured, right? And it can be quite challenging to. But I really I do feel I feel more equipped now on the other end of this than I did before. Again, I can't be able to do all the math, but I will be able to kind of make sure that I'm like, hey, what are the sources on this? Um, I have a couple of questions that are less easy to answer, which of course maybe
Could I just
yeah,
comment on that right there?
yeah,
So
hop in,
what
yeah,
you just said, Mark,
yeah,
that's one of my major goals right there. Like I don't pretend that yeah, you read this one book and then all of a sudden, chung, like yeah, you can totally
right,
perfectly discern all statistics you encounter. By no means. But by just having some instruction on what are the main categories to be looking at and then getting some practice, you can grow in that confidence so that you can kind of have an idea of what like how it works and kind of what things look like but also feel like as you're going down that process, and that can help you as you're then working on that out in real life. And as a believer, I want to equip my brothers and sisters in Christ to just simply not be as deceived. Because you all have a mission out there that God has called you to. And so to just help you to free up from some of that struggle to be more fully engaged in everything else God's called you to. Um, so so yeah, that's what I'm trying to do in
that's
the
great.
book.
Job done. And you mentioned in there too that like Christianity is a religion of truth in some respects, right? Jesus says,
Yes.
I am not just the way and the life, but he says, I'm the truth. And so this idea that like, the closer that we can get to truth, that will align with being closer to Christ in some respects, which is not to say like if you can understand, the best way to get to Biola, now you'll be closer to Christ. But that like the actual, not just like the technique and not just the data, but the actual kind of reality truth behind it. The closer we can get to that, the closer we'll be able to be towards Christ. One of the
Yeah, all truth
interesting
is God's
examples,
truth.
all truth is God's truth. That's right. Egyptian gold. So there's this kind of like interesting example that you bring in there is the efficacy of intercessory prayer.
Mm.
And so you bring it in near the end in some respects, but also you do this calculations in the middle to talk about the difference between coincidence, like coincidence, things that just seem to be happening at the same time, and then kind of causality, whatever. I would love for you, because I read that section and I was like, I think I get this. I would love for you to kind of just riff on that for a moment. And obviously you've done a lot of thinking and research on that. What do you think we can, for lack of a better word, know about the effect of intercessory prayer? So when we individually or corporately pray for something, what does it look like then to attribute answers to those prayers?
Okay, so my mind really has two different directions I want to kind of go on this, and the first one is one step further, which is there is a whole body of literature on this space of randomized controlled clinical trials on the effectiveness of intercessory prayer. Uh, Robert Byrd, 1988, wrote a paper on this where he got 393 people at a cardiac ward in a hospital in San Francisco to agree to participate in his study. And he took 26 different measurements on them and randomly divided them into two different groups so that they were statistically indistinguishable from these 26 measurements. Most of them are on their heart condition measurements. And then got there was 3 to 7 born again believers praying for every one of the people in the intercessory prayer group. And they were fed information on a weekly basis on the updates of the patients. Uh, so at the end of the study, uh, every different method of statistics he employed, you have better outcomes in the prayer group and than the control group. Now, even just reading my book, that might raise some questions about the design and, what about the people that weren't in the prayer group that are praying for the control group? They're just their relatives and so on. There's plenty of questions. It kind of lit a firestorm, but it also started a literature. And what happened in that literature was, at first, in 2000, the most prestigious review group, Cochrane Reviews, wrote that there's some promising things with these intercessory prayer studies. Research should continue. 2009, you got more studies out. I detect 42 different studies in this space that I've
Okay.
collected. Uh, 2009, they wrote, we now have enough evidence and studies published that we recommend work in this space no longer continue and resources be directed elsewhere because results are too inconclusive. And that's where they landed. And uh, what I'm talking about was some of the material for a chapter that didn't make the Statistics and Faith book. It'll show up somewhere else.
Okay.
But out of those 42 studies, I realized some of these are just kind of new age, like faith healing types things. They're not the Robert Byrd Christian intercessory prayer. What if I just pull out just the Christian prayer team studies? Even some of the Christian supervised studies didn't have all Christian intercessors. So those also didn't make my cut. It's just explicitly Christian intercessors. There's 10 studies that come out. And when you do the meta-analysis, which is a combining results across the different studies, very clearly the intercessory prayer group has the positive healing outcomes greater than the non-intercessory prayer group. So I just think it's an interesting story that most people aren't telling. So I wanted to mention that in this prayer space. But taking it back over to yours, which is more on a personal level,
Hmm.
I think what happens is they'll they'll ask God for something, maybe even pray on a regular basis for it. And over time, something happens that they could construe as an answer to their prayer. Okay. But the question becomes, did God really answer my prayer? Or did it sort of just occur as a course of time? In other
Sure.
words, was it a coincidence? And so, what I'm going after in that section of the book is how to discriminate between those two cases of was it God, was it a coincidence? Now, as I say this, let me just be very, very clear. I'm not recommending to sort of mathematize and think probabilistically about all your personal and prayer experiences. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm really trying to say is there is a mathematical underpinning behind some of the intuitive ideas that I want to put out there that can be made rigorous. And it's probably useful to do it like in a few instances, but I'm not saying that we should just ordinarily do that or try to adapt our thinking to that. I think that would be reducing our faith and damaging.
Hmm.
So want to be very, very clear about that. But the idea is that if prayers are more specific, then that's going to increase your confidence that it was a real answer to prayer. Now, some people will put a risk on like, I don't want to do that because then like, what if God doesn't come through? And then that becomes maybe a theological dimension of that. But
Hmm.
mathematically speaking, if you have just let's say an event of maybe I get uh, let's say a job offer tomorrow, okay, uh, that that may have a very, very low probability. Okay. But if I say it's a job offer within maybe the next month, well, the amount of ways that could happen just increased dramatically. And that thing called the amount of ways it could happen is the sample space. And so whenever you're looking at a probability, it's maybe a low probability event, but if the sample space is big, then you can think of it as you multiply those together, and often that brings the overall probability much bigger into a range that is sort of coincidence reasonable worthy. And so
Right.
whenever we're thinking about these things, think about the sample space, how many ways could it happen, along with how low the probability, and those have to multiply. And that's the essence of the idea there. And
Mm.
so practically praying specific prayers where the sample space is really small,
Hmm.
that's going to help you to see if that's really happening with some regularity in your prayer life or not.
That's risky. That's risky.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah.
One of my friends says that faith is spelled RISK.
That's right. Yeah, it's interesting. It is that okay, and this kind of, we're getting near the end here, but this does tee me into maybe one of the more meta questions that I have, and it's I think I know part of your answer. I don't know. We'll see. Do we need data for everything?
Great question. I would say not only no, but I would say we need to not have data for everything. So I'm a statistician, and I cheerlead statistics,
Yes.
obviously. But one of the things I tell my students on day one of a stats class is statistics statistics by its nature is dehumanizing.
Mm.
And what I mean by that is statistics is not about the individual. Statistics is about measuring the group as a whole. And so, very crudely, I say in the book, but I think it makes a memorable point. The average human being has one testicle and one ovary. Okay.
Right.
That's not one human being on the planet.
Right.
But yet, that's the statistical average. So, from a very personal, practical standpoint, that's like meaningless. And so we just need to understand what statistics are so that they can be framed and used in the appropriate way. And only then do I think, from a Christian worldview, do they become something that we really want to be using and working with. But they need to be kept in their proper place. Because outside of that, then you're gonna get eugenics emerge.
Or when I heard you talking about like analyzing or how you can analyze um, the reliability of an answer to prayer, um, my brain went to like marriage. So one of the other things you mentioned in the book is a stat that I've often heard quoted, which is that marriages of Christians or evangelical Christians in some contexts, whatever, they have the same failure rate as kind of the general populace. And so you bring that up in the book. But what it went for me was, I mean, I think statistics about marriage are helpful. And I think thinking through that, I think that's helpful. But I can't use statistics with my wife. Right?
Exactly.
Like
Exactly.
it will never be helpful for me to somehow bring in math to describe our relationship, like amount of time doing dishes, fill in any kind of blanks that you want here. It will be nothing but a net loss if I try to treat my marriage relationship through any kind of statistical lens. Uh, so that's a great word. Just the idea, like it's ultimately dehumanizing. It can be
Yes.
used for the benefit of humanity, but it will always and only ever be. And this is where I think a little was helpful for me as well, is that it can only and ever be a servant, and it can never be a master. But there's a tug and pull here, which is it is pushing. That's where eugenics can come in. It can be no longer just something to analyze, but something to use to work upon us or whatever. And so we have to be ever vigilant in how we deal with this kind of stuff. I'm going to drop you with like a fun question as somebody who has who teaches at a Bible college, who has a degree in Bible and then tons of degrees in mathematics. I get asked this often when I'm leading people through a reading of the Old Testament. I got to know you. I got to imagine you have thoughts, even if you don't have a definitive answer. Why is David in so much trouble when he takes a census of Israel?
I I literally one of my colleagues was asking this question yesterday. So what I think so in the Samuel account, I don't think it's very clear about there's some ambiguities as to exactly why so the question is what did God find fault with?
Yeah,
That's
that's right. I
the
mean,
yeah.
there's always the fun difference between the old, like the Samuel one and then the
In the
Chronicles one,
Chronicles.
where which is just like,
Yes,
maybe it was the
Satan
devil,
enticed him.
maybe it was God, maybe it was the devil, maybe it was God. But either way, what's the problem? Like, why is it
Yeah.
bad?
Yeah, so because in Chronicles, Satan enticed him. So from that standpoint, there seems to be some demonic element that he was led astray. Um, in my study of Samuel and Kings, where David, you have primarily two different categories of phrases where David is decision making, and you have he inquired of the Lord, and then you have he thought to himself. And it's the cases of David inquired of the Lord where he has these radical successes and God shows up and great stuff happens. And it's where David thought to himself, or he just kind of came up with it without inquiring of the Lord, that the bad stuff happens and he finds himself getting into trouble. And this census is one of those where he did not inquire of the Lord. And so it could be that it was to trust in human strength, in the
Hmm.
flesh, because
Hmm.
we know we have these big armies, we're just going to win, even though they saw way bigger armies get beat by
Right.
their small army because of
Hmm.
God. Uh,
Right.
so it could be kind of a faith flesh dimension, demonic, attack and leading, something in that space, I think. Um, but yeah,
It's
key thing,
complete conjecture. As somebody who's used to
seek the
speaking
Lord.
about things that they have expertise on, I appreciate the fact that you're willing to at least kind of put your toe out there, because I thought no, I haven't spoken to anybody who would have the expertise in census data and also at least a deep familiarity with, if not a modicum of expertise on the Bible as well. So, thank you for that. Jason, amazing. Thank you so much for your time today. And again, if anybody who's out there who's like, I see all these graphs, I follow Ryan Burge and I love him and I see all these graphs, but I do want to know, like, how can I understand statistics better? A great primer would be Statistics and Faith, a Christian guide to telling the truth with data. If we can understand the forces that are working with us and working against us a little bit better, then we can understand. And also if we can recognize God's voice in the background more clearly, then maybe we can be a little bit more like David and try to inquire of the Lord rather than just kind of pondering to ourselves. Jason, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Mark. I really enjoyed my time. Yeah, God bless you.